All right, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on our webinar for Rebuilding American Infrastructure with Sustainability and Equity, the RAISE grant, and incorporating Bikeshare into RAISE applications. I'm really excited to be joined by this amazing panel today to talk about how the new RAISE grant notice of funding opportunity this year, which was formerly BUILD and formerly TIGER before that, has signaled a commitment from the administration to putting people first, and how Bikeshare can play into that. We're going to talk to some pretty amazing folks today that have direct experience working both on the RAISE grant and its many iterations, as well as working with federal funding for Bikeshare programs, including successful past programs that have received funding through what was formerly TIGER. So I see we're still filling up in the room, so I'll just get started with a little bit of introductions while we're waiting for folks to get in. My name is Sahar Shirazi. I'm a principal and co-lead of our emerging mobility sector with Nelson Nygaard, based in Oakland, California, but formerly worked with both the governor's office here in California and with USDOT, the office that actually administered the TIGER grants formerly. So one of the panelists and I have known each other for some time from that role. I'm also joined by a pretty stellar panel today, including Kate Elliott from NACTO. Kate joined NACTO as a senior program manager, leading coordination for the American Cities Climate Challenge. And in that role, she curates trainings and events, supports the accelerator work, and monitors progress to help participating cities meet and beat their greenhouse gas reduction goals. Prior to joining NACTO, Kate worked at King County Metro Transit in Seattle, as well as the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency. She supported bus rapid transit on the Geary Boulevard project through critical environmental review milestones and approvals, and coordinated Vision Zero, terminal, and transfer environmental improvements across northern Seattle. So we're really excited to be joined by Kate today. We also have Jennifer McGrath, who is currently the Director of Research Park Programming for the University of Utah, where she has numerous responsibilities, including directing the design, implementation, management of pilot programs, new programs, activities, initiatives, and all things intended to meet the innovation, entrepreneurship, and community engagement goals of the park and park tenants. Prior to joining the university in this role, she was the Deputy Director of Community and Neighborhoods for Salt Lake City, where she helped manage and direct 7 divisions with over 200 people. She's also been the active transportation planner, strategic planner, and acting manager of planning and program development for Utah Transit Authority, where she successfully managed the TIGER application process, which brought $20 million in funding to the Salt Lake region for first and last mile connections to transit. So that was a formerly a TIGER grant application that included Bikeshare and was successful. So really excited to hear Kate talk a little bit about that experience. We're also joined by Mark O'Connor DiAquoi, who is the Deputy Director at Transportation Alternatives in New York City, whose mission is to create livable, inclusive, and safe streets in New York City, and to advocate for walking, biking, and public transit as alternatives to car travel. In his role, he's helped lead a multi-year campaign to successfully enact historic legislation, allowing speed safety cameras near most New York City schools. He's written extensively about the proper role of enforcement in Vision Zero and how to achieve both effective and equitable enforcement practices to reduce traffic fatalities, injuries, and the harm from inequitable policing. Marco has a background in freight logistics and distribution and holds a law degree from the Cardozo School of Law and a Bachelor in Politics and International Relations from London School of Economics. And finally, we're joined by Robert Mariner, who has over 24 years of transportation experience, most recently serving as the Deputy Director of the Office of Infrastructure Finance and Innovation in the Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy's office at USDOT. He also served as the program manager for the Transportation Investments Generating Economic Recovery, also known as TIGER, discretionary grant program, which was the initial program that led to BUILD and now RAISE. In 2009, Robert actually directed the development of the TIGER grant program and was responsible for the implementation, administration, and delivery of over 500 multimodal projects totaling over $8 billion in discretionary grants nationally. Prior to joining USDOT, Robert spent 6 years as an airport environmental planner and program manager. And Robert received his Bachelor's of Science in Civil Engineering from Morgan State University and a Master's of Art in Transportation Policy, Operations, and Logistics from the George Mason University of Public Policy. So, as you can see, we have quite a group here today, and we are really excited to jump right into this conversation. I'm going to just start with some allowing each of the candidates to talk. Sorry, candidates. We're actually having a debate, guys. Allowing each of our panelists to talk a little bit about sort of their area of expertise. And so, Robert, we'll start a little with you. Can you talk about some of the historic and anticipated federal funding opportunities that may be available for Bikeshare?
Sure, thanks, Sahar, and good afternoon, everyone. Just to hit very quickly to give my other colleagues, on the call an opportunity to chime in. Historically, the Bikeshare program has been funded through the annual, basically the state allotments that go to state departments of transportation. Historically, it was rolled into what we knew as the Safe Routes to School program. That was primarily one of the major focus areas for the Safe Routes to School program under the state departments of transportation through the Federal Highway Administration. However, most recently, the Federal Highway Administration and Congress, more importantly, has decided to roll in that Safe Routes to School program into the Transportation Enhancements program through federal highways. But then with the creation of Tiger, opened up the ability to fund bicycle pedestrian networks with discretionary grant funding. So if you go back to 2009, under Secretary Ray LaHood through Secretary Anthony Foxx, there were a number of bicycle pedestrian trails funded. As Sahar alluded to, in Utah, there was definitely bicycle pedestrian networks included as part of the rollout of enhanced transit services. You look at cities like New York City, which had their major Vision Zero initiative that was funded through the Tiger Discretionary Grant Program, which basically looked at separating bicycle pedestrian systems from the automobile and other vehicular traffic along New York City streets. And fast forward to the RAISE program today, I would hearken today's RAISE program back to the Ladders of Opportunity initiative under Secretary Anthony Foxx, whereby this administration is looking to provide additional modal options, provide connectivity to centers of employment, health and educational services, and places of employment. So that's just a quick, my quick take on historically what the department has done, and we're likely to see more investment in bicycle pedestrian networks in the future. Thanks, Ara.
Thank you, Robert. I would also just like to, backing up a bit, let our audience know that if you have questions during our discussions, we will take questions at the end, but we'd love to hear them as we're going through as well, if something sparks a question in your mind. Our goal today is really to set you all up for success and discuss how Bikeshare can help achieve greater outcomes that have been highlighted by the administration, that have been highlighted by recent events as needed, as well as to make sure that you have all the tools that you need going forward through the RAISE program. So there is a question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to type your questions in there and we'll get to as many of them as we possibly can today. So thank you. Thanks, Robert. Moving on to Kate. So thinking about NACTO as an organization that represents a lot of cities throughout the US, can you talk a little bit about how NACTO's member cities and their Bikeshare operators have supported essential workers throughout the last year during the COVID crisis and how that might be moved forward?
Sure, happy to. I think this audience probably knows intimately well that there was a big cycling boom, and there's been a lot of kind of ebbs and flows in that boom over the past year. And in New York right now, we're seeing that boom continue with no signs of slowing down. City Bike just broke some of their records just a couple of weeks ago with the nicer weather finally coming. And so I think we know that folks are interested in more mobility options, and then they're really excited to take advantage of them in the cities where they've invested in more bicycling infrastructure, where they've expanded. I think member cities have really, and their operators too, have supported bike share and supported cycling in two primary ways throughout the course of the pandemic. I'd say initially, one of the trends that we started seeing were particularly when it was a little bit unknown what the risks were on other forms of transportation, mainly transit. You know, initially when we had our first stay-at-home orders throughout the month of March, there still wasn't a mask order. So there's definitely a lot of fear in terms of, you know, commuting on mass transit or being around in close proximity to other people. And so cycling was a really great alternative to be able to be safe and outside where there was more ventilation. And so a lot of operators were partnering with cities to be able to offer free bike share programs to essential workers, particularly to healthcare workers in the first kind of, I'd say the roughest months of the pandemic last year in the spring. And a lot of that I think continued throughout the year. And then another thing that we saw and is a trend that I think is also here to stay is investing in expanding cycling infrastructure and doing so in a really quick and tactical way. And those were two kind of main ways that happened. We saw the expansion of temporary walking and biking lanes, or walk, bike, and rolling lanes, where you saw cities kind of expanding the barrier, taking the parking lane to be able to expand the infrastructure that way. And then, you know, shutting the streets down altogether, only allowing local traffic and having open streets programs. But one thing I want to kind of call out and draw some attention to, because I think it really matters in the context of this conversation, is that these things did not all happen perfectly, and they didn't all work seamlessly. And when we first started seeing the stay-at-home orders, a lot of bike share operators, private operators, cut their service altogether. Bikes were locked, or they left city streets altogether, and all of a sudden the essential workers that were still commuting to work and wanted to bike didn't have that option to get around. And I think that what we saw over the course of the pandemic, particularly in the spring and summer of last year, we saw these essential workers and the organizations that support them, and organizations like NACTO and many other nonprofits, really pushing folks to demand for more equitable distribution of service, to demand for bringing transit back to the routes that needed it the most, the routes that support essential workers, that support communities dependent on transit, that don't have, you know, another way to get around, that don't necessarily own a vehicle. And so I think I wanted to draw that connection because one opportunity that RAISE gives is for a little bit more regulation of these operators, right? By being able to support some of the expansion of bike share and funding of bike share through federal programs. You can also ensure that you're reaching communities that may be a little bit harder to reach, historically Black and Brown communities that maybe now are being more suburbanized as, you know, cities become less and less affordable. So I think that's one thing I wanted to just kind of draw to, that while we are seeing a bicycling boom, we have to make sure that we're still addressing the community needs and really holding operators accountable, because cities do have that power.
That's a really great point, Kate. And I think that as we dig into this conversation, we'll hear more about the requirements around federal funding as both a challenge and an opportunity. So thank you for bringing that up. I see that there's been a couple questions in the chat. We're happy to answer them as we go through, but I just want to ask that everyone put their questions into the question and answer box if possible, just so we have them in one place and we don't lose anyone's questions throughout the conversation. So thank you. So Jennifer, you are the person on the panel who has helped actually create a successful bike share grant through the Tiger program. Can you talk a little bit about how you made the case for bike share in the Tiger grant application, and specifically about the benefit cost analysis, because that has been particularly challenging for some folks in terms of quantification of benefits in programs like this?
Yeah, thanks, Sahara. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today for this really interesting conversation. I already am learning a lot from my fellow panelists. So we did a BCA for our application, which originally included 466 projects to improve first last mile access to 37 stations throughout the 6 counties in the Greater Salt Lake region. And this application was part of UTA's sort of first phase of implementing first last mile strategies to improve access to stations through the Greater Salt Lake region. Those 37 top priority stations were chosen specifically based on their ability to increase ridership and improve safety associated with improvements that would encourage residents to access light rail and commuter rail, with a particular goal of increasing the number of people who access those systems by foot or by bike. Some of the variables that were monetized in the BCA were reduction in vehicle operations and maintenance costs, pavement damage, and noise reduction that we would attribute to VMT reductions because of mode shift. Safety benefits due to a reduction in crash rates with reduced VMT attributed to mode shift. Safety benefits in general, looking at the communities around the planned improvements. We also looked at the health benefits attributed to people accessing transit stations by walking or biking, and the emission reductions associated with the reduced VMT attributed to the mode shift. To be fair, we also did offset those benefits and we monetized the disbenefit attributed to greater travel times as a result of that mode shift from personal vehicles to transit. In 2015 dollars, the project benefits as a whole were expected to lead to an overall net present value of about just over 70 million, with a benefit cost ratio of just over 2, and that was using a 7% discount rate. If we use a 3% discount rate and we looked at both, it increased to a 3. We used methodology that was in the National Cooperative Highway Research Program report, 522. It was the guidance for analysis of investments in bicycle facilities. So that was our basis for the analysis that was done. And we did break the benefits down. And in terms of commuters accessing transit by cycling or walking, we attributed somewhere in the range of $3 to $5 million in savings. We didn't break it down to just Bikeshare alone, but the bike ped benefit was in that range. So I hope that that's helpful.
That's great.
Thank you. It was a long time ago.
Yeah, I'm impressed that you remember all those details.
I do not remember them. I looked up my notes.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that's really helpful, especially as the new criterion doesn't necessarily have calculations associated with it. So I think that folks will need to be utilizing what's available, both through Federal Highways, NCHRP, and the USDOT webinars and guidance, but also finding other sources that may be able to help them quantify some of the benefits that we haven't quite captured yet in the literature. So thank you for that. Marco, City Bike for All is the largest bike share program in the US, and I believe the largest outside of China. So can you talk a little bit about why New York City voters are supporting public investments in bike share so strongly?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to. So Siena College did a poll late last year that found that nearly 2/3 majority of New York City voters support subsidies that promote cycling in New York City, including City Bike. So there was overwhelming support for subsidizing bike share in New York City, and we know that subsidies are routine for every other form of public transit, right? Including subways, buses, and even here in New York City, the mayor's ferry system, which serves just a fraction of the users of bike share, of City Bike in New York City. But unlike those forms of transit, City Bike in New York City has not only recovered from its pandemic dip in ridership, which was less than other modes, as Kate mentioned, but it began exceeding its pre-pandemic ridership levels as early as September, October of 2020. And in New York City, to my knowledge, it is the only bike share system of a major city in North America that does not have public subsidy. And it stands out. It stands out because, you know, in this country, we subsidize, we also subsidize car driving. We subsidize car driving and infrastructure. We subsidize gasoline production and distribution and the construction of highways. And those, our dependence on car traffic and the proliferation of car trips, particularly in lower income communities and communities of color, contribute to higher rates of asthma, environmental pollution, and environmental injustice in those areas. And interestingly enough, the polling by Siena College showed that lower and middle income New Yorkers strongly support subsidies. Latinx voters were the strongest supporters in New York of subsidies to encourage bicycling, with 79% support for public subsidy. And so to your question, why is it so popular? So first of all, riding a bike is fun and energizing. It's healthy and it's fast. And that last part may be the most important. So there's a perception by some that biking is only for leisure and health, right? Something that either only kids do or something that you have to wear spandex to do. But biking is very often the most practical tool to get around, whether for commuting or shopping. I grew up in Denmark, where in some cities, more than 50% of workers commute by bike. And people do so in those numbers because it's convenient and it's fast. Here in New York City, the distance of an average car trip is about 2 miles, which is perfect for a bike ride for daily trips in most cities. In Manhattan, the average car trip speed, or the average speed for cars, is about 5 miles per hour. That can easily be done by bike, and it has been shown also many times that a bike is often the fastest way to get around New York City. And so when people have the option of bike share, they realize these benefits. And Kate highlighted the bike share boom that is happening in New York City now, and that boom is happening because people recognize how efficient and easy it is when it works.
Thank you, Marco. I think that's a really interesting point that we don't talk often about, especially in congested urban areas. I always ride bikes in New York because it is the fastest and easiest way to get between places. And often we think of bikes as slowing us down when in fact they often speed us up in certain situations. We have a question that actually comes off of that discussion quite well, which is thinking about the financial model for bike share programs and how they require continuous support. However, the RAISE program is a one-time funding opportunity. So when we're talking about adding bike share components or bike share programs into RAISE applications, are we thinking about allowing a municipality to invest in one bike share system to get started or expanded, and then using things such as subsidies or fees to support the ongoing operations? Is that generally the way that your systems have worked? I guess Marco and Jennifer, this is kind of a question for you too.
Marco, do you want to go ahead, or I can jump in?
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, this was part of our challenge and our consideration is the funds not only don't pay for the entire system, they don't pay for ongoing operations and maintenance. So you do have to have an honest conversation with your bike share operator about what the ongoing funding source is going to be. For us, our bike share team has been able to get CMAQ funding for certain things. They have a lot of private sponsorship dollars that go in to help run their operations long term. But this is a pickle, and I'm not sure it's likely to be any different. But the good news is and I think this is true for most infrastructure, once it's on the ground, it's hard to take it away. So getting those stations in, getting those bikes purchased and having a system there, it's a lot easier to fund it once it's there than to go from ground zero. People don't like having something taken away. So if you can get a system built or expanded through these grant dollars, it can oftentimes be worth it.
Great, thank you. So it looks like we may have lost Robert, so hopefully he can jump back in. But Kate, I'll just jump over to you, and thinking about, you know, I'm sure that NACTO, as well as a lot of folks both on this panel and listening in, have been tracking a lot of the announcements coming out of DC, out of the new administration. So can you talk a little bit about how you think Bikeshare fits into the Biden administration's climate and equity policy goals? And in particular, are there other opportunities to enhance Bikeshare programs outside of RAISE? So thinking about most recently the MUTCD rewrite, we'll call it, that you all worked on. Are there other opportunities like that that you can see to enhance the Bikeshare programs coming out of DC?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that question. The NACTO team has been very busy since January. I mean, really, since throughout the pandemic, I think we've really boosted our federal policy efforts to be able to support our member cities. I think, you know, kind of starting with the American Jobs Plan, there's a lot to be excited about. I think there's a few different things that I wanted to kind of highlight, but at the same time, you know, we remain sort of cautiously optimistic because the devil really is in the details. So one thing that it does is offer $20 billion to prioritize roadway safety for all users. And I think that that alone really shows a huge shift in the conversation from the prior administration, and that's something to be excited about. Another component that could support Bikeshare work specifically is the reconnecting of communities, really highlighting the fact that our infrastructure decisions to date, the interstate highway system, the expansion of highways, has really come at the detriment of a lot of Black and Brown communities. And, you know, there's funds now to hopefully we'll see more to support undoing those past decisions and being able to connect communities through different transportation forms, Bikeshare being one of them. One thing that, you know, NACTO is also advocating for is being able to fund money directly to cities and, you know, sort of unlink the commingling between states and cities, competing often for the same funding pot, and then, you know, to offer more local control to cities and to ensure that cities can review some of the state projects that are going to affect their jurisdiction. And, you know, right now, in the absence of really having a program that offers direct aid, these discretionary grants are so important because they do offer money directly to the agencies that are going to be responsible for regulating Bikeshare, for expanding and improving first and last mile connections. So I think that is definitely one thing to kind of highlight too. But, you know, in terms of like some of the details that really do matter and the things that we're really paying attention to on the federal level, the MUTCD has been a huge priority of ours. Many of the folks I'm sure tuning in know that the comment deadline was May 14th, but I think rewriting the MUTCD and really reframing who it prioritizes and how is extremely important to be able to achieve the safety, climate, equity, and sustainability goals of the administration. There are currently barriers within the MUTCD that hold cities back from doing the projects that they want. I mean, we know there are several projects, for example, street murals, if you think of the Black Lives Matter murals, that are not MUTCD compliant, but that, you know, definitely create a vibrant street environment and can offer safety. So I think that's just one example. There's several others related to pedestrian warrants. I'd say a big thing that we're really advocating for is eliminating the practice of using the 85th percentile for setting speeds, and really instead setting speeds based off of safe speed targets and designing streets so that they're more supportive of lower speeds, since that is what leads to the most severe injuries on our streets. One thing to kind of be excited about when it comes to the MUTCD, and I know it's a very complex road manual, but despite that fact, there was over 25,000 comments on the MUTCD, which I think is historic in nature and really shows that, you know, people want to see this changed. that when you are pushing the administration, when you are pushing your leaders and you are pushing folks both within every level of government, that change can happen. I think people are listening. The MUTCD has newfound attention and media that it never had before. I don't think anyone knew that it was the manual for urban traffic control devices before, you know, this year, except for like a handful of, well, not a handful, except for every single traffic engineer, of course. But, you know, now policy experts know, now advocates know, now we're all really kind of singing the same chorus. And when we're able to be aligned on something like that, it can really push the needle. And I think that can be true of some of these other programs too. There's a few things on the docket that I wanted to highlight that present a really big opportunity for Bikeshare as well. So that's the Bikeshare Transit Act, which would make Bikeshare a reimbursable expense for transit projects. I think that's something to be excited about. That's something we're hoping to see in the upcoming reauthorization bill. And another one is also the expansion of commuter benefits to include Bikeshare, right? So commuter benefits now, they cover the cost of transit, but they haven't yet been expanded to include the cost of Bikeshare. So I think those are two things that are really helping to build momentum to the expansion of Bikeshare. And, you know, we're seeing now with the way that the criteria has changed for RAISE that there's, you know, should be a lot more competitiveness for Bikeshare expansion projects, for these first last mile projects that do incorporate Bikeshare elements.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and it sounds like you guys have a lot going on, but well-timed, and agree that the MUTCD is one of those deep dive technical documents that could actually do a lot if we can shift the language and the focus on it. And I think one thing you highlighted that we should just really reiterate is that, you know, that currently federal funding does go to states through formula funds for the most part, and RAISE is really one of the few discretionary grant programs that can be administered directly to either a city or a transit agency or any public entity, including those that will partner with other public entities. So there's a lot of opportunities present in this particular program as well. Did we lost Robert again, it seems. So I think that one thing you highlighted, Kate, is thinking about the federal formula funds and the way that they're classified in terms of federal highways, federal transit, and I believe the 11 other administrations that I can never remember all of. But you know, we often talk about bikes as public transit, but in the federal context, public transit's already strapped for funds, and unless the formula and the percentages change, that's likely continuing to be true. Most of our federal formula funds go to highways, and there's limited opportunities for active transportation in the requirements for those funding streams outside of CMAQ and TAP funding. So RAISE is, as you mentioned, a rare opportunity for discretionary funding given by the policy office itself for outcome-based projects. And thinking about the new criteria that have been included in this new process and all the benefits that you mentioned, Bikeshare, excuse me, is theoretically highly competitive. But we also know that RAISE grants, because of this context, are oversubscribed and themselves are very highly competitive. So Jennifer and Robert, if we have him back, could you guys speak a little bit about the grant application process itself? Some of the challenges and the opportunities when putting together the narrative, the BCA, the environmental review section that you came across. And maybe Jennifer, you can speak a little on your process itself, the applicant, and then Robert, if we can get him back to speak to the USDOT expectations.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to. I mean, as we've already touched on today, and probably most of the people participating today know, these grant funds cannot pay for Bikeshare systems comprehensively. They can be used to do design, construction, they can, you know, help with the stations, but they cannot pay for rolling stock, so the bikes themselves, and they can't pay for ongoing operations and maintenance. And unless or until the definition of transit or a transit vehicle changes to include Bikeshare bikes, which, you know, I think is highly unlikely to happen, that's probably not going to change. So including bike share in an application can be tricky. The reality is that standing up or expanding a bike share program is relatively inexpensive when you compare it to other capital costs, like, you know, a rail extension. You know, those costs are not, they're not comparable to one another. So when you're thinking about including bike share in this, you have to think through the fact that you're federalizing the project, which adds time and cost. Now, the Bike Share Transit Act could be transformational in this area. And, you know, I, for one, am a big fan, and I really hope that that and efforts like that continue and are embraced by this administration and administrations going forward. But, you know, that said, I think we used, you know, private sponsorship dollars for the cost of bikes, and we were able to count that as match. So, you know, for me, both now and then, I consider bike share to be a critical component of our transportation network. You know, bike share gives people the ability to access transit with a bike without having to own or maintain that bike. And it's important, a really important part of making transportation and transit system accessible and attractive to people. So each agency needs to determine if the benefit they get from that inclusion outweighs the time and the cost that can be added by using those federal funds. We weighed that, we thought it was worth it, and I'm still convinced today that including bike share strengthened our application and made it more robust. But I do think it's, you know, it's something you have to really think about and consider and make sure that you know you're going in with your eyes wide open, you know what you're getting into, because those dollars have to be fronted. You know, they don't just write you a check, it's a reimbursement. So there are a lot of things to be considered.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. And Robert, can you hear us? Okay.
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Oh yes, great. Yeah, we were just discussing the challenges and opportunities when putting together Tiger grant application, sorry, Ray's grant application, and thinking about in the federal context, how can bike share help achieve some of the new goals and the new criteria that have been included, coming from a USDOT perspective? How can it help strengthen an application?
Sure. And I think it would definitely strengthen, you know, obviously if you're looking at a complete streets type of project within your community, you know, introducing bicycle pedestrian, you know, not necessarily a trail, but pathways along those complete street areas, reconstructed areas is definitely something to consider. Or if you're looking at, you know, building out a much broader bicycle pedestrian trail network, which not only provides, you know, recreational support, but also provides more commuting benefits, or in addition to the recreational support, you know, some additional commuting benefits. So, you know, when it comes to thinking of, you know, how best to incorporate bike share into your raised grant application, it's obviously not a silver bullet for every type of project. You know, when it comes to a municipality, as I just stated, I would focus more so on if you have a complete streets type of project, to incorporate bike lanes, you know, into that initiative, or if you're looking at building out or introducing a much broader bicycle pedestrian network of trails for enhanced connectivity, as well as additional mobility for those that, unfortunately, you know, there are a lot of people across the country who still just don't have cars. And, you know, the introduction of bicycle pedestrian networks and bike share services, you know, definitely provides that additional source of mobility for those that don't have cars. And, you know, surprisingly, that in many cases, that's in many urbanized areas as well, where a lot of residents don't have automobiles, you know, that they have access to. So hopefully that helps, you know, answer that question, Sahar.
Yeah, thank you. I think that that's really helpful. I would add just that, you know, thinking through the new criteria around equity and climate change in particular, environmental justice and such, there may also be opportunities to utilize bike share programs to create mode shift and reduce greenhouse gas emissions and enhance access for different communities. So when thinking about these larger projects, considering how Bikeshare may fit into a corridor or a larger program may be a good opportunity as well. Marco, it looked like you had something to add. No, okay.
I was just unmuting myself.
Great, okay, thank you. Well, that's perfect timing because we're going to jump to you next, where we want to talk a little bit about the New York City bike share program, the City Bike System, which again is the largest in the world outside of China. I know I keep repeating that, but it's very impressive in terms of docks. And so we wanted to talk a little bit about how that's working out in terms of potential expansion. Is there thought around a regional approach to bike share between New York City and Jersey City and Hoboken, for example? And is there any interplay between the public subsidy for bike share and political issues such as the mayoral race that's coming up?
Yeah, so at Transportation Alternatives, we have been campaigning for a citywide bike share for all throughout New York City. Several years ago, we did so in the part of the city where City Bike started in New York City. We then also had a campaign in the Bronx to bring City Bike to the Bronx. We were carried around a paper cutout of a City Bike that a number of elected officials, including the Bronx Borough President, sat on for a photo op, and really just demonstrated the need. And there is now an expansion that has been happening in stages in New York City, where it was initially very focused, concentrated in Manhattan. It now covers all of Manhattan, but has also expanded into parts of Brooklyn, still just the downtown and westernmost parts of Brooklyn, but still a significant portion also into Queens and into all of southern and western part of the Bronx. It is still not in Staten Island. We have a campaign specifically for that, and the polling also that Siena College did showed that there is significant demand on Staten Island for bike share there. So that expansion is slowly happening. There's certainly a connection between public subsidy and the further expansion. We know that in order for bike share with a dock system to work, there has to be a high density of the dock stations, right? And in order for that to work out financially, there really has to be a public subsidy as you start getting into the areas of the city where you will see less ridership. So we can only realize equitable bike share in New York City and really any other place if there is public subsidy of that system. So that's one thing, and elected officials and candidates for mayor and council here in the city are increasingly recognizing that and seeing that bike share is part of an equitable transportation system and is really a social justice issue as well. We know how access to transportation is the greatest way to break down barriers to poverty. So in New York City, with that expansion, at that same time, you also saw expansion into Jersey City in New Jersey and Hoboken, just across the Hudson River from New York City. It's ironic to many people in Staten Island that another state nearby got it for the forgotten borough of Staten Island got it. So that's one thing to point out. Regarding how this is how bike share is what role it has in the mayoral election, it has played a role. It is something that candidates have weighed in on, and I believe at this point, out of the 8 leading candidates for mayor in New York City, 4 candidates have committed to public subsidy of bike share, and one of those 4 has stated that they would have the city take over, basically have municipal control bike share and make it a true part of the city's public transit system. So it is definitely something that is on the radar of mayoral candidates, and something that that the leading mayoral candidates have weighed in on and have done so favorably.
Great, that's great to hear. So we're getting a few questions in, and I think that we can merge them a little bit as we're going through. I want to make sure to get to our audience questions as well. So Jennifer, I'm going to turn to you, and I think because you had mentioned in your experience some of the challenges of incorporating Bikeshare into the former Tiger program included what could and couldn't be paid for in terms of the grant money. So we have a question here that says that Raise will not pay for operations or the bikes themselves. Can you clarify what aspects of a Bikeshare program Raise can fund? So I'm going to turn that to you, since you've had the experience of actually applying, but I also wanted to just add to it, if you can talk a little bit about what's happened in Salt Lake City around the Bikeshare program since the program has launched and you received the funding.
Yeah, happy to. As I mentioned before, the grant funds can't pay for a bike share system comprehensively. We used ours for design and construction of the stations, but not for the bikes themselves and not for ongoing operations and maintenance. And we were successful in being able to do that. And that is, that's not nothing. There is an expense involved in the design work and the flat work and the stations themselves. So again, it was actually beneficial for us, but it is something to think about. If you don't have a source for that ongoing operations and maintenance, you really want to think about whether you want to put the system in or not, or expand it. But so as far as Green Bike, which is Salt Lake City's bike share system, at the time of the Tiger application, Green Bike, which started in 2013, already had a lot of their stations near our rail lines and our bus system. At the time, it was providing just over 100,000 rides in 2015, and was recognized at the time as one of the fastest growing bike share systems in terms of ridership in the country. At the time, the system had about almost 25 private sponsors, 5 strategic partners, just over 200 bikes and 33 stations, and it was in pretty high demand. And the grant was meant to expand the green bike sharing system within Salt Lake City, also outside of Salt Lake City within the Salt Lake County area, and to bring new bike share programs to Ogden City in Weber County and to Park City in Summit County. I think with the introduction of micromobility, providing additional alternative modes of transportation for connections to transit and just in general, Salt Lake City's bike share program has continued to be successful and has continued to grow. But my guess, if I were, speaking through a crystal ball, is maybe not as much as they would have otherwise. But again, I mentioned previously, I see bike share as a critical component of our transportation system. I would love to see bike share here and throughout the country continue to get support and grow. I really look forward to the day when USDOT is able to be more inclusive in terms of what they're able to fund and include this as part of a transportation system. Today, Green Bike has about 47 stations in the Salt Lake City or Salt Lake County area. And it's a combination of both e-bikes and non-e-bikes. They're going to have stations in Ogden soon as well. And the Tiger Grant funded 11 brand new stations in the Park City, Summit County area through that grant. So they have nothing, and now they have 11, and their system is all e-bikes and doing quite well. On kind of a related note, and to build on something that Marco said, when I was at UTA, we did a formal study to look at a regional organizational model for bike share, and specifically looking at a UTA to see if the transit agency should take on a more active role in that, up to and including potential ownership of the program. And while the timing of that wasn't really great and nothing really ended up happening with that, I think it still makes a lot of sense for our region and others to look at and think about how to operate bike shares in this way regionally, And in conjunction with or as part of the transit system and network and the actual transit agencies themselves, especially in cities like ours where bike share programs aren't operating under a for-profit model. In areas where they are for-profit, that wouldn't necessarily make sense or work, but for many of us who are in a nonprofit model, it probably makes sense as these systems grow to start looking at them in coordination with the transit agencies and more regionally.
Great, yeah, and we're seeing a sprinkling of different models around the country, so it's interesting to think about what makes sense where. Thank you for that, Jennifer. We have a question from Yosemite National Park, the Yosemite Conservancy, who is in year 4 of a no-fee bike share pilot in Yosemite Valley using grant funds, and they're interested in scaling up and what the finances may look like for mature bike share operations. Are there opportunities in your mind? I think this is probably a question for you, Robert, but perhaps you as well, Kate or Marco, in terms of existing bike share programs that may be scaled up through the RAISE program or other funding opportunities.
Yeah, if I could just jump in real quick, I do apologize for the service interruptions, but quite quickly for the Yosemite, I'm wondering where exactly the service would be provided, because if that fee-less bike share program is located within the national park, then unfortunately that's not something that RAISE could provide funding for. It would have to be it's not allowed to be on federal property. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But just more broadly, to echo, Jennifer's comments about what RAISE funding can be used for and what it can't be used for. I mean, unfortunately, it can be used for the rolling stock for the bikes itself, more often than not even the station. So it's really the infrastructure that will support the placing of the stations and, the locating of bikes that RAISE funding can be used for. So hopefully that's helpful. On the Yosemite example, it's just unless Congress passes or broadens the eligibility to allow these funds to be used on federal lands, then unfortunately RAISE would not be eligible for those purposes.
Thanks, Robert. So we have a question from Rebecca, and I'm not sure if anyone knows the answer to this. Kate, you might have the best place for this answer. Are there more dockless bike share programs now, or are docked bike share programs still being implemented and thriving?
Yeah, I'd have to take a look at our shared micromobility snapshot, and I can drop that in the chat after this to sort of compare kind of what the standings are between the two different types of systems. But I'll say that regardless of how many of one there is versus the other at this point, what we've been seeing throughout kind of, the introduction of more different micromobility options is that people still take more trips on docked systems, that docked systems see more use throughout the day. And I think, like Marco said earlier, City Bike reached new records this past month. City Bike is an expanding and thriving system that people use consistently. And I think there are several other docked systems throughout the US that are experiencing that same thing, whether it's in DC or the San Francisco Bay Area or Honolulu. The pandemic has obviously impacted a lot of these systems, but that's true of both docked and micromobility systems. And I think that it's important to recognize that docked systems allow cities to have more input on where the stations are, can allow you to sort of regulate them in more ways, because you can ensure that there are docked stations in the neighborhoods that need them the most, in the neighborhoods that depend on transit the most. You can put them next to transit stations and really expand access to transit that way. So I would definitely continue to push and advocate, we as an organization continue to push and advocate for docked systems. And I think there's a way that the two systems, like Jennifer mentioned earlier, can really build off and support one another. And they don't necessarily, have to, it doesn't have to be one or the other, right? Like even New York, we're starting to see an introduction of more micromobility and scooter modes. And I think that's something that, has also been really popular across the board because it's such a fast and convenient way to get around. And like Marcus said earlier, it's fun. And that's true of both scooters, which I think we've seen don't have quite the same barrier to entry as biking does in some places. So I would really just say at this point, from my perspective, both are thriving and they're thriving in different ways. And they're really important aspects of connecting folks to transit.
I would say too, to add to what Kate just brought up, there's a reliability component that you get with a docked system that you just don't get with undocked micromobility. And for people who are using active transportation as part of their commute, they need that reliability. If you're going to get off a train and you have another mile or 2 miles to go at the end of your trip and you aren't certain that there's a mode of transportation there waiting for you, you're not going to take transit. And so that reliability component has become critical for our transit commuters. And we would hate to see that. We would hate to see that go away. And that's one of the main reasons why we consider, Bikeshare to be so critical to our transportation network.
Great, thank you. And I think that's probably why we see that Bikeshare, docked Bikeshare is often used for commutes as well, for that reliability reason, for sure. So we only have a few minutes left. I do have a question here that I think we can just direct to the chat itself. There's a question about any of the groups or agencies represented, whether we're engaged in rethinking federal transportation funding to incorporate active and shared transportation beyond CMAQ and TAP. And how do we get the feds to consider active and shared transport an integral part of the transportation system? So I know that Kate has put some links in here on work that NACTO is doing. I think that if others have other work that they'd like to highlight or opportunities for folks to get more engaged, it'd be great to include them in the chat box for folks to follow up on. We only have a minute left, so I just want to, first of all, thank everyone so much for being here today. Lots of amazing information and insight in this group. And it seems that we understand Bikeshare to be a really important catalyst for a lot of the criteria and the goals that USDOT as well as our communities have around safety, around access, around equity, around economic activity, around climate goals. So just if anyone has, let's do 30-second closing thoughts on incorporating Bikeshare into raise grants. We'll start with you, Kate.
I would just say that Bikeshare is really important because we don't want a car to be a prerequisite to opportunity. And that, it's important that when we think about expanding access to jobs and we think about economic recovery, Bikeshare is a key component to that. It really expands the transit shed. Right now, only half of Americans are even in walking distance to transit. But if you think of how many Americans are within 3 miles of transit, that completely changes the picture. And Bikeshare can really create that, important connection. And, I'd say, like we've mentioned earlier, the emphasis on equity and climate that we're seeing from the new administration allows Bikeshare projects to be a lot more competitive. And there's a lot of ways that Bikeshare can piggyback off of other projects that you may already be thinking about for federal funds. So although it can be challenging to federalize projects, it can be worth it when you see kind of the expansion of access and opportunity at the other end.
Great, thank you, Kate. Marco, closing thoughts?
Yeah, I would just note, this panel is mainly about funding. So I want to just highlight that it's not all about funding for Bikeshare, right? It's critically important. It can help things get off the ground and help sustain them, but it is not the most important thing. The most important thing is the political will. The money is there, whether it's New York City's $900 million annual repavement expenses or some other source. Like everything else, it's political. And what's important for our elected officials and agency leaders to recognize is that Bikeshare can be part of a much broader effort to address climate change, fighting for environmental justice. It benefits local storefront businesses, retail, restaurants. Bike and ped infrastructure does, and has been shown to do so over and over again. and would also create spatial dividends by reducing the demands on our roads from cars that would then allow us them to use that space for uses that benefit people more holistically. And so I would say to the different localities and different advocates and agency representatives, bring in your Department of Health, your small business service, incorporate that into the process and impress upon them how this will benefit their goals and the broader goal of your locality, and make them be part of the public facing effort to win and sustain Bikeshare, and also ensure that you channel the constituents who will benefit and who will be using them, so you have people standing up for it, to make sure that it remains, that the perception of its popularity is true with reality, and you can sustain it going forward.
Great point. Thank you, Marco. Jennifer?
I just want to say ditto to what my counterparts have said. I agree with all of that. Bikeshare is a critical component of our transportation network for all of those reasons. And I think to Marco's point, bringing in the health department, we did that on our grant application, as well as anybody engaged in economic development, in access to opportunity, all of those things, those are all real. So include all of those components if you decide to include Bikeshare in your application, and best of luck to everyone.
Thank you, Jennifer. And Robert, you want to round us out?
Yeah, I'll be very quick. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So if there was any other time, for Bikeshare, now is the time. This administration is going to be very, very supportive with the rolling out of Bikeshare, projects across the country, because it is directly in line with meeting their policy goals, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, having a positive impact on reduction and impacts to climate change, and so forth. So as you're thinking through your projects, think of incorporating bicycle pedestrian amenities, because one, I know that they'll be very well received by the career staff at the Department of Transportation, coupled with being, equally as supportive and by the political staff at the department as well. So Bikeshare, Bikeshare, Bikeshare.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists, as well as our attendees today. And we hope that you have all gained something useful from this webinar. I know I've learned a lot, and we look forward to seeing your Bikeshare projects as they launch. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.